The blood-red sun dipped below the horizon as Nora Zimmerman stumbled off the stagecoach into the dusty main street of Weaverville, California, clutching her handkerchief to her mouth to muffle the violent cough that had followed her all the way from Boston. It was July 1873, and Weaverville was still riding the wave of gold rush prosperity, despite the fact that many of the surrounding claims had long since been exhausted. The town stood nestled in a valley of the Trinity Alps, surrounded by pine forests and rugged terrain, a far cry from the refined streets of Boston where Nora had spent her 22 years. "Miss, you all right there?" The stagecoach driver handed down her single trunk, eyeing her with concern as she struggled to regain her composure. "Yes, thank you. Just the dust from the journey." She tucked the handkerchief into her sleeve quickly, hiding the telltale spots of blood. The journey had been taxing, but she'd made it, 3,000 miles from the whispers that had driven her away. The driver tipped his hat and climbed back onto his seat. "Hotel's just down the way," he pointed. "Can't miss it. Good luck to you, miss." Nora gathered her strength and gripped the handle of her trunk, dragging it toward the 2-story building with Weaverville Hotel painted across its wooden facade. The effort sent another spasm of coughing through her chest, but she pressed forward. She had come too far to falter now. The hotel proprietor, a stern-faced woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun, looked up from her ledger as Nora entered. "Room for one." "Yes, please. I'm not certain how long I'll be staying." Nora placed a few coins on the counter. "I've come to find my uncle, Thomas Zimmerman." "Do you know of him?" The woman's expression softened slightly. "Tom's your uncle. He's got a small spread about 3 miles east of town. Keeps to himself mostly, comes in for supplies every couple weeks." Relief flooded through Nora. At least he was still here. Her mother's brother had left for California 20 years ago, sending occasional letters with tales of gold and opportunity. When the doctors in Boston had given her their grim diagnosis, and the whispers about consumption had started circulating in her social circle, his remote cabin in the mountains had seemed like her only escape. "Is there someone who might take me to his property tomorrow?" "Riley's livery can set you up with a horse or wagon, or you might ask Ross Abernathy if he's heading that way. His ranch borders your uncle's land." The woman slid a key across the counter. "Room 3, top of the stairs." Nora thanked her and dragged her trunk up the narrow staircase, each step an effort against her weakening lungs. Once inside her room, she sank onto the bed, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability as tears spilled down her cheeks. The doctors had given her a year, perhaps 2. Tuberculosis, they called it now, though consumption was the whispered word that had caused her friends to suddenly find excuses not to call. Even her fiancé, Edward, had broken their engagement, unable to face the prospect of a wife who might not live to see their first anniversary. Nora wiped away her tears. She hadn't come west to die, but to live whatever time she had left with dignity, away from pitying glances and hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Morning came with golden light streaming through the thin curtains. Nora dressed carefully in her simplest traveling dress, a dark blue cotton that wouldn't show dust too badly. She pinned her honey blonde hair into a practical bun and headed downstairs, determined to find transportation to her uncle's property. The dining room was nearly empty at this early hour, save for a man sitting alone by the window, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as she entered, and Nora was struck by the intensity of his gaze-blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face beneath a shock of dark brown hair. Nora ordered a simple breakfast from the young girl serving tables and tried not to stare at the stranger, who seemed to have no such compunction about watching her. When he stood and approached her table, she straightened her spine, preparing for the usual pleasantries. "Miss Zimmerman." His voice was deep and carried the distinctive drawl of the West. "Yes." She was surprised he knew her name, Ross Abernathy. He tipped his hat slightly. "Mrs. Gunderson mentioned you're looking to get out to Tom's place. I'm headed that direction after I finish some business in town." So this was the neighbor the hotel proprietor had mentioned. Nora assessed him quickly, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in practical ranching clothes, rather than the flashier attire of the gamblers and salesmen she'd observed since arriving. "That would be most appreciated, Mr. Abernathy." "Most folks just call me Ross." He gestured to the chair across from her. "Mind if I join you? We can discuss the arrangements." Nora nodded, and he sat down, folding his frame into the small wooden chair. "Your uncle expecting you?" he asked. "I sent a letter, but I'm not certain it arrived before I did." Nora felt another cough building in her chest and fought to suppress it. "I'm his niece from Boston." "Long way to travel alone," Ross observed, his eyes narrowing slightly as she pressed her napkin to her lips. "Necessary circumstances," she replied simply, not willing to elaborate. Ross seemed to respect her reticence. "I can take you out there around noon if that suits. I've got a wagon that'll handle your trunk better than horseback." "Thank you. That would be perfect." Their conversation was interrupted by another coughing fit that Nora couldn't contain. When she pulled the napkin away, she was horrified to see a spot of blood. Ross had noticed too, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more complex. "I should go prepare my things," Nora said quickly, rising from the table. Ross stood as well, his voice lowered. "Miss Zimmerman, if you're not well enough for the journey today—" "I'm perfectly capable, Mr. Abernathy," she interrupted, her voice firm despite its breathlessness. "I'll meet you at noon." Nora spent the morning resting and repacking her trunk, saving her energy for the journey ahead. At precisely noon, she descended to find Ross waiting with a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 chestnut horses. He helped her up to the seat with strong, calloused hands, then secured her trunk in the back. As they pulled away from the hotel, Nora felt the curious gazes of townspeople following them. Already, she could sense, there were whispers starting. The new woman in town, pale and coughing, leaving with the handsome rancher. The road out of Weaverville wound through pine forests and open meadows, climbing gradually into the foothills. Ross handled the team with quiet confidence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of local knowledge. Nora found herself relaxing in his company, drawn to his straightforward manner. "How long have you lived in California, Mr. Abernathy?" "Going on 10 years now." "Came west after the war with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. Worked cattle drives, saved every penny until I could buy my own piece of land." He glanced at her. "What brings a Boston lady all the way out here to the wilds of Trinity County?" Nora hesitated, then decided on a partial truth. "My parents passed away last winter. There was little left for me in Boston. Sorry to hear that." His tone was genuine. "Your uncle's a good man, keeps to himself mostly. He'll be glad for the company, I expect." They rode in companionable silence for a while, until a particularly rough section of road jostled the wagon, triggering another of Nora's coughing spells. This one was worse than before, leaving her gasping and light-headed. Ross pulled the wagon to a halt, his face etched with concern. "Here," he offered his canteen. "Small sips." The cool water helped, but Nora could feel Ross's eyes on her, assessing. When she finally caught her breath, she found the courage to meet his gaze. "It's consumption, isn't it?" he asked quietly. Nora's heart sank. So much for escaping the whispers. "The doctors call it tuberculosis now." She expected him to recoil, to put distance between them as everyone in Boston had done. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than fearful. "My younger sister had it," he said finally, urging the horses back into motion. "Folks out here believe the mountain air can help, some even get better." "Did your sister?" Nora asked, hope fluttering in her chest. A shadow crossed his face. "No, but she was much further along when we brought her west. You look stronger." They completed the journey mostly in silence, Nora lost in thoughts of what awaited her, Ross seemingly content to let her be. As the sun began its descent, he guided the wagon off the main trail onto a narrower track that wound through a stand of ponderosa pines before opening onto a small clearing. A sturdy log cabin stood in the center, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Behind it rose steep, forested mountains, their peaks still holding patches of snow despite the summer heat. A small creek bubbled along one edge of the clearing, and a modest vegetable garden stretched along the cabin's southern side. "Uncle Thomas's home," Ross announced, pulling the wagon to a stop. The cabin door opened and a bearded man stepped out, rifle in hand. He was taller than Nora remembered, his once dark hair now mostly gray, but she recognized her mother's eyes in his weathered face. "Who's there?" He called, suspicious until his gaze fell on Nora. Recognition dawned slowly. "Mary's girl." Nora climbed carefully from the wagon. "Yes, Uncle Thomas, it's Nora." Thomas Zimmerman lowered his rifle, emotion crossing his face as he approached. "Last time I saw you, you were knee-high to a grasshopper." He stopped a few feet away, suddenly awkward. "Your letter only arrived yesterday. I wasn't sure when to expect you." "I'm sorry to arrive with so little warning." Nora felt another cough building and couldn't suppress it. As she bent double with the force of it, she saw her uncle's expression change from welcome to concern. Ross was beside her in an instant, supporting her elbow until the spell passed. "Tom, let's get your niece inside. She's had a long journey." Thomas hurried forward then, taking Nora's other arm. Of course. Come in, child." The cabin's interior was simple but clean, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with chairs, and a small sitting area with a bookshelf surprisingly well-stocked for such a remote location. 2 doors led off to what Nora presumed were bedrooms. "I've only got the one spare room," Thomas said apologetically. "It's small, but it gets good morning light." "I'm sure it will be perfect," Nora assured him, sinking gratefully into a chair by the fire. The mountain air had a chill to it, despite the summer season. Ross brought in her trunk, setting it by the bedroom door. "I should head back before dark," he said, though Nora noticed he seemed reluctant to leave. Thomas nodded. "Thanks for bringing her out, Ross. You staying for supper?" "Better not. Got animals to tend to." Ross turned to Nora. "Miss Zimmerman, if you need anything, my ranch is just over that ridge to the north, about a 30-minute ride." "Thank you for your kindness today, Mr. Abernathy." Nora managed a genuine smile. "I appreciate it more than I can say." Something flickered in his blue eyes, but he simply tipped his hat and departed, leaving Nora alone with the uncle she barely knew and the uncertain future that awaited her in these mountains. The first few days at Thomas Zimmerman's cabin were difficult. Nora's body, weakened by disease and travel, rebelled against the altitude and unfamiliar surroundings. Her coughing spells came more frequently, often leaving her exhausted and breathless. Thomas watched with barely concealed alarm, clearly unprepared for the severity of her condition. On the 3rd morning, when Nora couldn't rise from bed, he disappeared for several hours, returning with a stern-faced woman he introduced as Martha Johnson, the closest thing to a doctor in these parts. Martha examined Nora thoroughly, listening to her chest with a primitive stethoscope and asking direct questions about her symptoms and the progression of her illness. "The mountain air can help," she confirmed when they were finished, echoing Ross's earlier words. But you need rest, good food, and time for your body to adjust. No exertion for at least 2 weeks. Thomas hovered anxiously as Martha prepared a tincture of herbs. Will she recover? Martha's expression remained neutral. Some do. The disease can go dormant if the conditions are right. But I won't lie to you, Mr. Zimmerman, it's a battle, and not everyone wins it. After Martha left, Thomas sat beside Nora's bed, his rough hands clasped before him. I'm not much of a caretaker, he admitted. Your mother was always the one who knew what to do when sickness came. You don't have to take care of me, Nora assured him, though her voice was weak. I just need a place to stay. I can manage my own care. Nonsense. Your family. Thomas straightened his shoulders. We Zimmermans stick together. Despite his determination, it was clear that Thomas was out of his depth. His cabin, while adequate for a solitary man, lacked many comforts Nora had taken for granted in Boston. The food was simple and repetitive: beans, salt pork, biscuits. The water came from the creek and had to be boiled. Worst of all, Thomas seemed almost afraid to touch her, as if her disease might leap from her body to his through the slightest contact. On the 5th day, as Nora sat wrapped in blankets on a chair outside the cabin, trying to absorb the healing mountain air Martha had prescribed, the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. Ross Abernathy rode into the clearing, leading a second horse that carried several bulging sacks. Miss Zimmerman. He tipped his hat as he dismounted. Thought I'd check in, see how you're settling. Mr. Abernathy. Nora was suddenly conscious of her appearance, hair loosely braided over one shoulder, wrapped in a quilt despite the warm day, face pale and drawn. It's kind of you to visit. Thomas emerged from the cabin, clearly relieved to see Ross. Good timing. I was just heading out to check my traps. Ross unloaded his saddlebags, revealing a bounty that made Nora's eyes widen. Fresh vegetables, a jar of preserves, a loaf of bread that looked far more appetizing than her uncle's heavy biscuits, and several books. My housekeeper sent these along, Ross explained, though something in his expression made Nora wonder if it had been his idea rather than some unknown housekeeper's. Thought you might appreciate some variety. That's very thoughtful, Nora said, genuinely touched. Thomas was already reaching for his rifle. Would you mind sitting with Nora while I'm gone? Shouldn't be more than a couple hours. Ross nodded. Got nowhere else to be. Nora wanted to protest that she didn't need a minder, but exhaustion kept her silent as her uncle disappeared into the trees. Ross settled onto a nearby stump, seemingly comfortable with the silence between them. Finally, Nora spoke. You didn't have to bring all this. I'm sure you have more important matters than checking on your neighbor's sick niece. Ross's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Ranch mostly runs itself this time of year. Besides, I remember how my sister craved different foods when she was ill. Same meals day after day didn't sit well. Your sister, Nora said softly. You mentioned her before. What was her name? Rebecca. His eyes took on a distant look. She was 17 when the consumption took her. Bright as a new penny, always had her nose in a book. I'm sorry for your loss. Ross nodded his acknowledgement. It was 5 years ago now. We brought her out here from Missouri, hoping the change would help. He looked directly at Nora. That's why I recognized the signs when I met you. I've seen this illness before. And yet you offered to drive me to my uncle's, Nora observed. Most people can't get away fast enough when they realize. Most people are fools then. Ross's tone was matter of fact. It's not caught so easily as people fear, especially not from a brief encounter. My family lived with Rebecca throughout her illness, and none of us contracted it. His straightforward acceptance of her condition was like a balm to Nora's spirit, wounded by months of avoidance and whispers. For the first time since her diagnosis, someone was looking at her as a person rather than a walking embodiment of disease. "Still," she said, "it's more than most would risk. I appreciate your kindness." Ross shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Your uncle's a good neighbor." "Least I could do." They fell into conversation about less weighty matters, the history of the area, the changes Weaverville had seen since the height of the gold rush, the challenges and rewards of ranching in such rugged terrain. Ross, Nora discovered, was an engaging storyteller when drawn out, with a dry wit that frequently made her laugh, though each laugh threatened to trigger her cough. When Thomas returned from checking his traps, he found them still talking, Nora's cheeks showing more color than they had in days. He seemed pleased, if a little surprised, by Ross's lingering presence. "Staying for supper?" Thomas asked, much as he had the day Ross brought Nora to the cabin. This time Ross accepted. "If it's no trouble." Over a meal improved considerably by Ross's contributions, the three of them continued their conversation. Nora learned that Ross had fought for the Union in the Civil War, had come west to escape its memories, and had built his ranch from nothing into one of the most successful operations in Trinity County. He employed several ranch hands but lived alone in the main house. "No wife?" Thomas asked bluntly, earning a sharp look from Nora. Ross seemed unperturbed. "Haven't found a woman willing to put up with me yet." His eyes met Nora's briefly across the table. "Or maybe I just haven't been looking in the right places." After dinner, as Ross prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "I could come back tomorrow if you'd like. Bring some more books, maybe. Reckon it gets pretty dull out here." "I would like that," Nora said, surprising herself with her eagerness. True to his word, Ross returned the next day and the day after that. Each visit brought some small gift: fresh eggs from his chickens, a pot of honey from his bees, a bouquet of wildflowers he'd gathered along the way. More precious than these offerings, though, was his company. He seemed to sense when Nora had the energy for conversation, and when she needed quiet companionship. On good days, they would sit outside, Ross reading aloud from one of the books he'd brought while Nora worked on mending or simply closed her eyes to listen. Thomas observed their growing friendship with a mixture of relief and concern. One evening, after Ross had departed, he sat across from Nora at the table. "Ross is a good man," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes, he seems to be," Nora agreed, sensing there was more to come. Thomas cleared his throat. "He's also a man who lost someone to the same illness you have. I worry that he might be seeing ghosts, so to speak." Nora hadn't considered this possibility, and it troubled her. "You think he's replacing his sister with me somehow?" "Not exactly." Thomas rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "More that he might be trying to save you where he couldn't save her. It's not a fair burden for either of you." "There's nothing to save, Uncle Thomas." Nora's voice was soft but steady. "I've accepted what's coming. I just want to live whatever time I have left with dignity and purpose." "Don't be so quick to accept defeat," Thomas said gruffly. "Martha Johnson's seen people recover, and you're already stronger than when you arrived." It was true. The mountain air, rest, and improved diet had begun to show effects. Nora's coughing spells were less frequent, and when they came, they were less violent. She had more energy, able to help with simple chores around the cabin. The color had returned to her cheeks, and she'd even gained back a little of the weight she'd lost. Ross noticed these improvements too, his blue eyes brightening each time he discovered Nora engaged in some new activity, tending the garden, feeding the chickens Thomas kept, or once, memorably, attempting to chop kindling, an endeavor he quickly but gently took over. As summer gave way to early autumn, bringing cooler temperatures and spectacular colors to the mountainsides, Nora found herself looking forward to Ross's visits with increasing anticipation. They had fallen into a comfortable routine. He would come 3 or 4 times a week, often staying for the evening meal, sometimes bringing work with him that he could do while keeping her company. One crisp September afternoon, as golden aspen leaves drifted down around them, Ross surprised Nora with a suggestion. "I thought you might like to see a bit more of the area," he said, gesturing to the wagon he'd driven over. "If you're feeling up to it, there's a meadow not far from here with a view that can't be beat." Nora hesitated, glancing toward the cabin where Thomas was taking his afternoon nap. "I shouldn't go too far. It's just over the ridge, 20 minutes at most. We'll be back before he wakes." Ross's expression was hopeful. "You've been cooped up here for nearly 2 months now." The temptation of new scenery won out. Nora fetched her shawl and left a note for her uncle, then allowed Ross to help her into the wagon. The short journey took them through a stand of aspens whose leaves shimmered gold and copper in the afternoon sun, then up a gentle slope to a meadow that opened onto a breathtaking vista of the Trinity Alps. Snow-capped peaks rose against the azure sky, their lower slopes clothed in the fiery colors of autumn. The air was crystalline, so pure and clear that Nora felt she could see forever. "It's magnificent," she breathed, drinking in the beauty before her. Ross spread a blanket on a flat rock and helped her settle onto it. "I come here sometimes when I need to remember why I chose this life." He sat beside her, not too close, always respectful of her space. "Figured you might appreciate it too." "I do." Nora pulled her shawl tighter against the breeze. "Thank you for bringing me." They sat in companionable silence, watching the play of light across the distant mountains as the sun began its descent. Nora was acutely aware of Ross beside her, his solid presence both comforting and increasingly distracting. Over the weeks of his visits, her feelings for him had grown from gratitude into something deeper and more complex. She found herself noticing small details, the way his hair curled at the nape of his neck, the laugh lines around his eyes, how his hands, though large and calloused from ranch work, moved with surprising gentleness when he helped her. "You're staring," Ross said, breaking into her thoughts. Nora blushed. "I'm sorry. My mind was wandering." "Where to?" His tone was light, but his eyes were serious as they met hers. "I was thinking about how different my life is now from what I expected." Nora looked back at the mountains. 6 months ago, I was engaged to be married, planning a future in Boston society. Now here I am in the wilderness with a future measured in uncertain terms." "Your fiancé, he ended things when you got sick?" Ross asked, a hard edge creeping into his voice. Nora nodded. "Edward came from a prominent family. They had concerns about complications." "Complications," Ross repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of such concerns. "I don't blame him," Nora said, though part of her did. "It was a practical decision." "Practical," Ross snorted. "Sounds like a man who never truly loved you." The bluntness of his assessment startled Nora. "That's rather harsh. Edward cared for me in his way." "His way wasn't good enough then." Ross turned to face her fully. "A man who loves a woman stands by her through anything, sickness, poverty, whatever comes. That's not practicality, Miss Zimmerman. That's what love means." Nora was struck speechless by the passion in his voice. Ross seemed to realize he'd overstepped and looked away, jaw tight. "I apologize," he said after a moment. "It's not my place to judge your former fiancé." "No, it's all right." Nora found her voice again. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps what Edward and I had wasn't love at all, but something more convenient." The setting sun cast a golden glow across Ross's face as he turned back to her. "You deserve better than convenient, Nora." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cooling air. Before she could respond, a familiar tightness gripped her chest, and she was seized by a coughing spell more violent than any she'd experienced in weeks. Ross was immediately at her side, supporting her as the coughs racked her body. When it finally subsided, Nora was horrified to see bright spots of blood on her handkerchief. Worse, Ross had seen them too. "I'm taking you back," he said, his voice tight with concern. "You've overexerted yourself." Despite her protests that she was fine, Ross was already helping her to the wagon, his arm strong around her waist. The return journey was silent. Nora huddled beneath an extra blanket Ross had produced from somewhere, fighting back tears of frustration and embarrassment. Just when she'd been feeling almost normal, almost able to imagine a future beyond her illness, her body had reminded her of its frailty. And now, Ross had witnessed it at its worst: the blood, the weakness, the reality of what consumption meant. When they reached the cabin, Thomas was waiting anxiously, having found her note. He helped Ross get her inside and settled by the fire, fussing over her with uncharacteristic attention. "I shouldn't have suggested the outing," Ross said, his face drawn with guilt. "It was too much too soon." "It's not your fault," Nora insisted, though her voice was weak. "I wanted to go, and it was beautiful, worth it, even with this setback." Ross didn't look convinced. He stayed only long enough to ensure she was comfortable, then made his excuses, promising to return in a day or two when she'd had time to rest. As he left, Nora caught a glimpse of his expression: troubled, conflicted, and something else she couldn't quite name. For the next 3 days, Ross didn't come. Each morning, Nora woke with the hope of seeing him ride into the clearing, and each evening she went to bed disappointed. Her cough had settled back to its usual pattern, but the memory of those moments in the meadow, both the closeness she'd felt to Ross and the subsequent reminder of her illness, left her in a state of emotional turmoil. On the 4th day, Thomas announced he needed to go into Weaverville for supplies. "I'll be gone overnight," he told Nora. "Will you be all right here alone?" "Of course," she assured him. "I'm much better now. Go do what you need to do." After Thomas departed, Nora found herself restless. She tidied the already clean cabin, then decided to bake bread, a skill she'd been practicing under her uncle's surprisingly competent tutelage. As she worked the dough, she hummed softly, trying to focus on the task rather than her thoughts of Ross and why he hadn't returned. The sound of a horse approaching drew her to the window. Her heart leapt when she recognized Ross's chestnut mare, but as he dismounted and approached the cabin, she noted a tension in his movements that hadn't been there before. Nora wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and opened the door. "Mr. Abernathy, what a pleasant surprise." Ross removed his hat, revealing hair that looked as though he'd been running his hands through it in agitation. "Miss Zimmerman, your uncle in. He's gone to Weaverville for supplies. Won't be back until tomorrow." Nora stepped aside. "Would you like to come in? I'm just making bread." Ross hesitated, then nodded, following her inside. He stood awkwardly by the door, hat in hands, until Nora gestured to the table. "Please sit. Would you like coffee?" "No, thank you." He sat, placing his hat carefully on the table. "How are you feeling after the other day?" "Much improved." Nora returned to her bread dough, kneading it perhaps more vigorously than necessary. "I'm sorry if I frightened you." "You didn't frighten me." Ross's voice was low. "You reminded me." Nora looked up, meeting his troubled gaze. "Of your sister," he nodded. "Of watching someone I cared about suffer, knowing there was nothing I could do to help." He ran a hand through his hair, confirming her earlier observation. "I thought I could be stronger this time, but seeing you like that—" "I understand if you don't want to continue our friendship," Nora said quietly, her heart aching at the thought. It's unfair of me to subject you to those memories. That's just it. Ross stood abruptly, pacing the small room. I've spent these last few days trying to convince myself to stay away for exactly that reason, but I can't. He turned to face her. I don't want to stay away from you, Nora. The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. Ross, let me finish, please. He took a deep breath. What I feel for you isn't about memories of Rebecca or pity or anything else. It's about you, your courage, your grace, the way you face each day with dignity despite what you're going through. The way you laugh at my poor jokes, the thoughtful questions you ask, how you listen like what I'm saying really matters to you. Nora's hands had stilled in the dough, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. I know it's too soon, Ross continued. We've only known each other a few months, and I know your situation makes things complicated, but I need you to understand that when I look at you, I don't see your illness, I see you. Ross, Nora's voice trembled. What are you saying? He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just before her. I'm saying that I'm falling in love with you, Nora Zimmerman, and that scares me more than anything because I know what might lie ahead. But I'd rather face that with you than walk away from what we could have together, however long or short that might be. Tears filled Nora's eyes. You can't mean that. You know what the doctors said, doctors aren't always right. Ross reached out, hesitating just before touching her flower-covered cheek. And even if they are, even if we only have a year or two, wouldn't that be better than never knowing what we could have been to each other? A tear slipped down Nora's cheek, leaving a track through the dusting of flour. I couldn't ask you to tie yourself to someone who might leave you alone so soon. You're not asking, I'm offering. Ross's voice was gentle but firm, freely and with open eyes. The town already whispers about me, Nora warned, about my condition. They'll say you're foolish or worse. Let them whisper. Ross's mouth quirked in that half-smile she'd grown to love. I've never much cared what people say. Despite everything, her fears, her illness, the rational part of her mind that said this was madness, hope bloomed in Nora's chest. She looked down at her flower-covered hands, then back at Ross's earnest face. I'm a mess, she said, attempting humor through her tears. You're beautiful, he corrected, finally giving in to the impulse to touch her cheek, gently wiping away a tear with his thumb. Flower and all. A laugh bubbled up in Nora's throat, turning into a small cough that she quickly controlled. Ross, are you really sure about this? About me? In answer, Ross leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought fresh tears to her eyes. It was a promise, an affirmation, a declaration more powerful than words. When they parted, Ross rested his forehead against hers. Does that answer your question? People will say you're crazy, Nora whispered, though her heart was singing. Kissing a woman with consumption. Then we'll face it together, Ross said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Whatever comes, Nora, we'll face it together. In that moment, with Ross's arms around her and the scent of rising bread filling the cabin, Nora allowed herself to believe in possibilities she'd thought forever close to her. Not just survival, but living. Not just enduring, but loving and being loved in return. The next morning, Thomas returned from Weaverville to find Ross and Nora sitting close together at the table, their clasped hands resting between them. One look at their faces told him everything he needed to know. Well, he said, setting down his purchases, I suppose I should have expected this. Uncle Thomas, Nora began nervously, Ross and I have my blessing if that's what you're after. Thomas's gruff tone couldn't hide the twinkle in his eyes, though I reckon you'd go ahead with or without it. Yes, sir, we would, Ross confirmed, his grip on Nora's hand tightening slightly. but we'd prefer to have it. Thomas regarded them thoughtfully. Ross, you understand what you're taking on here. I do. And you, Nora, you're sure about this? Nora nodded. More sure than I've ever been about anything. Thomas sighed, though his expression was more relieved than concerned. Then I guess we'd better start planning a wedding before the weather turns. Mountain winters are no joke. Over the next few weeks, word spread through Weaverville and the surrounding homesteads about Ross Abernathy's intention to marry Thomas Zimmerman's niece, the one with consumption. Reactions were mixed, from genuine well wishes to barely concealed disapproval and whispered predictions of doom. Martha Johnson, who had continued to check on Nora periodically, was cautiously supportive. "The mountain air is helping," she told Ross privately. "And happiness is a powerful medicine in its own right. I've seen sicker patients improve when their spirits lift." Ross's ranch hands were loyal enough not to question his decision to his face, though Nora caught concerned glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Only Miguel, the oldest among them who had been with Ross since the beginning, spoke directly to her about it. "Boss is a good man," he told Nora one afternoon when he'd accompanied Ross to the cabin. "Best I've ever worked for. He deserves happiness however it comes." "I want that for him too," Nora replied, touched by the man's evident affection for Ross. "I'll do everything in my power to give him that." Miguel studied her for a long moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what he saw in her eyes. "Then you have my support, Miss Zimmerman. And I'll make sure the others come around too." The wedding was set for mid-October, before the first snows would make travel difficult. It would be a small affair at Ross's ranch, with just Thomas, Martha, the ranch hands, and a few of Ross's closer friends from town in attendance. The minister would ride out from Weaverville to perform the ceremony. As the day approached, Nora divided her time between preparations and continuing her regimen of rest and fresh air. To everyone's cautious optimism, her condition remained stable, not cured by any means, but not deteriorating either. The bad days still came, when coughing fits left her weak and sometimes brought up blood, but they were interspersed with good days when she could almost forget she was ill. 3 days before the wedding, Ross arrived at the cabin with a surprise: a beautiful dress of deep blue silk, not a wedding gown exactly, but far finer than anything Nora had brought with her from Boston. "It's from San Francisco," he explained as she ran her fingers over the luxurious fabric. "I had Martha help with the measurements. I hope it fits." "It's exquisite," Nora breathed. "But Ross, this must have cost a fortune. I wanted you to have something special." He shrugged, attempting to downplay the gesture, though his eyes watched her reaction carefully. "If you don't like it, I love it," she interrupted, rising on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "And I love you." It was the first time she'd said the words aloud, though they'd been in her heart for weeks. Ross's face lit up and he pulled her into a gentle embrace. "I love you too," he murmured against her hair. "More than I ever thought possible." The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, the mountains resplendent in their autumn colors beneath a sky of perfect blue. Thomas drove Nora to Ross's ranch in the wagon, both of them silent with anticipation and emotion. The ranch house was larger than Nora had imagined, a substantial 2-story structure of logs and stone that spoke of Ross's success and hard work. Flowering vines climbed the porch posts, and someone had hung garlands of pine boughs and late-blooming wildflowers around the doorway and windows. Inside, the main room had been transformed for the occasion. The large oak table had been pushed against one wall and laden with food and drink. Chairs were arranged in rows facing the stone fireplace, where the minister waited. The ranch hands and other guests were already seated, turning to watch as Thomas escorted Nora through the door. Ross stood by the fireplace, dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. When he saw Nora in the blue silk dress, his eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed unable to breathe. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. Nora and Ross exchanged simple vows, promising to love and cherish each other for whatever time they were granted together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ross kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women present dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward was joyful, with music provided by one of the ranch hands who played the fiddle and another on harmonica. There was dancing, though Ross made sure Nora didn't overexert herself, and plenty of food and drink. Even the most skeptical guests seemed to soften as they witnessed the evident love between the newlyweds. As evening fell, the guests departed, leaving Ross and Nora alone in their home. Thomas had decided to return to his cabin, giving the couple privacy for their first night together. "Are you tired?" Ross asked as they stood on the porch, watching the last wagon disappear down the lane. "It's been a long day." "A little," Nora admitted, "but a good tired." Ross led her back inside, where the fire still burned low in the grate. "I have something to show you," he said, taking her hand and guiding her toward the stairs. On the second floor, he opened a door to reveal a beautiful bedroom, clearly recently prepared. A large four-poster bed dominated the space, covered with a handmade quilt in shades of blue and green. A dressing table stood by the window, which Nora noticed faced east to catch the morning sun. Most striking, though, was the wall opposite the bed, which had been constructed almost entirely of glass panes, offering a breathtaking view of the mountains and sky. "Ross," Nora gasped, "it's amazing." "I wanted you to be able to see the view, even on days when you might not feel strong enough to go outside," he explained, suddenly looking uncertain. "Is it all right? It's perfect." Nora turned to face him, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain all she felt. "You're perfect." Ross laughed softly. "Far from it, but I'll do my best to be the husband you deserve." That night, as they lay together in the moonlight streaming through the glass wall, Nora rested her head on Ross's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time since her diagnosis, she allowed herself to hope for more than just dignity in her remaining days. She dared to hope for a future uncertain, perhaps, but filled with love and possibility. Winter came early to the mountains that year, bringing heavy snows by early November. Nora found herself grateful for Ross's foresight in building the glass wall, as it allowed her to experience the stunning beauty of the winter landscape, even on days when the cold air would have triggered her cough. Life settled into a rhythm. Ross managed the ranch with his usual efficiency, often taking Nora with him on his rounds when the weather permitted. On bad days, when her illness flared, he would sit with her for hours, reading aloud or simply holding her through the worst of the coughing spells. Thomas visited regularly, growing more comfortable in his role as uncle now that the initial awkwardness of caring for an ill niece had been relieved. He and Ross got along well, sharing a love of the land and a quiet, steadfast nature that Nora found comforting. Christmas came, bringing with it a celebration more festive than any Nora had expected. The ranch hands and their families joined Ross, Nora, and Thomas for a feast, followed by gift-giving and songs around the fire. Ross's present to Nora was a small, upright piano, transported at great expense from San Francisco and installed in the corner of their main room. "I remembered you mentioned playing in Boston," he said as she stared at it in disbelief. "Thought you might miss it." Nora hadn't touched a piano since before her illness, but as she sat on the bench and placed her fingers on the keys, the music came back to her, filling the room with a melody that brought tears to more than one pair of eyes. Winter gave way to spring, and with the melting snows came a surprising development. Nora's coughing spells, which had remained relatively stable through the winter months, began to decrease in frequency and severity. Martha Johnson, visiting for her regular checkup, listened to Nora's chest with growing astonishment. "Your lungs sound clearer," she announced. "Much clearer than I would have expected at this stage." Ross, who had been hovering anxiously nearby, stepped forward. "What does that mean?" Martha removed her stethoscope, her expression cautiously optimistic. "It means the disease might be going dormant. It happens sometimes, especially in younger patients who get proper care and clean mountain air." She looked at Nora appraisingly. "And I suspect being happy hasn't hurt either." "So she could recover?" Thomas asked from his position by the door. "I wouldn't go that far yet," Martha cautioned. "The disease can remain dormant for years, then flare again if conditions change. But yes, with continued care and the right conditions, she could live a relatively normal life." The news was like a ray of sunlight breaking through clouds. Nora hardly dared believe it, but as spring progressed into summer, the evidence became harder to ignore. Her strength returned, her appetite improved, and the coughing spells became rare enough that days would pass without a single episode. By their first anniversary in October, Nora had gained weight and color, looking more like the vibrant young woman who had left Boston than the pale, fragile figure who had arrived in Weaverville. Ross watched her transformation with a mixture of joy and cautious hope, never taking a single good day for granted. "I'm thinking of expanding the garden next spring," Nora told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. "Maybe adding some fruit trees along the south side of the house." Ross smiled, recognizing what she wasn't saying explicitly, that she was planning for a future beyond the next few months. "Sounds like a fine idea. I've always had a fondness for peaches." "Peaches it is, then." Nora leaned against his shoulder. "And perhaps some apple trees, too, for pies." "Planning to fatten me up, Mrs. Abernathy," Ross teased, wrapping his arm around her. "Perhaps." Nora hesitated, then placed her hand over his. "I've been thinking. Martha says I'm continuing to improve. That the disease seems truly dormant now." "Yes," Ross said carefully, not wanting to press her on whatever was clearly on her mind. I think it might be time to consider whether we might start a family." Nora's voice was soft but steady. "If you want that, of course." Ross went very still beside her. "Nora, are you sure? Martha said it could still come back if conditions change, yes, and pregnancy would certainly be a change." Nora turned to face him. "But she also said many women with dormant tuberculosis have gone on to have healthy children without relapse." "I don't want to risk losing you," Ross said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not when we've come so far." "Life is always a risk," Nora reminded him gently. "You taught me that when you kissed me despite knowing what I had, when you said we'd face it together." Ross searched her face, seeing the determination there alongside the hope. Finally, he nodded. "If Martha thinks it's safe enough to try, then yes, I want a family with you, Nora. I always have." The next year brought changes to the Abernathy ranch. Nora's garden expanded as planned, fruit trees were planted, and by early spring, her condition remained stable enough that Martha Johnson gave her tentative approval to try for a child. "Monitor yourself closely," the older woman advised. "At the first sign of relapse, any increase in coughing, fever, night sweats, you come straight to me. Understand?" Nora nodded, too overwhelmed with emotion to speak. The possibility of motherhood, which she had thought forever denied to her when she received her diagnosis, now seemed within reach. Summer came, bringing with it the news they had both hoped for, and feared. Nora was expecting a child. Ross's joy was tempered with anxiety, and he watched her like a hawk for any sign of returning illness. But as the months passed, and Nora's pregnancy progressed normally, his fears began to ease. Thomas was ecstatic at the prospect of becoming a great uncle, and threw himself into crafting a cradle from pine wood harvested from his own land. The ranch hands, now fully supportive of their boss's marriage, contributed their own gifts: a handmade mobile of carved wooden animals, a tiny pair of boots that wouldn't fit the baby for years. Winter settled over the mountains once more, and Nora's time drew near. Ross insisted on bringing Martha Johnson to stay at the ranch for the final weeks, unwilling to risk Nora being caught without help if the baby came during a snowstorm. On a clear, cold night in January 1876, after a labor that tested Nora's restored strength but didn't overwhelm it, she gave birth to a healthy son. They named him Thomas Ross Abernathy, honoring both her uncle and his father. As dawn broke, sending golden light streaming through the glass wall of their bedroom, Ross sat beside Nora on the bed, their newborn son cradled in his arms. Outside, the snow-covered mountains glowed pink in the early light, a backdrop to the miracle they held between them. "He's perfect," Ross whispered, counting tiny fingers for perhaps the 20th time. "And you're incredible." Nora watched them, her heart so full it seemed impossible it wouldn't burst from her chest. 3 years ago, she had been given a death sentence, told to prepare for a swift decline and early grave. Now she sat in a home filled with love, with a husband who had seen beyond her illness to the woman beneath, and a son who represented everything she had thought forever lost to her. "We did it," she said softly. "We faced it together, just like you promised." Ross leaned down to kiss her forehead. "And we always will, whatever comes next." The years that followed brought more blessings than challenges to the Abernathy family. Nora's tuberculosis remained dormant, and though she maintained the habits that had helped her recover: fresh air, good nutrition, adequate rest, she increasingly lived the life of any rancher's wife, busy with household duties, gardening, and caring for their growing family. Young Thomas was joined by a sister, Rebecca Mary, in 1878, named for Ross's lost sister and Nora's mother. 2 years later, another son, James, completed their family. The children grew strong and healthy, showing no signs of their mother's former illness. Thomas Zimmerman eventually moved from his isolated cabin to a small house Ross built for him on the ranch property, where he could be close to his niece and her family while maintaining his independence. He became the children's beloved Grandpa Tom, teaching them to fish in the creek that ran through the property and telling them stories of the early gold rush days. Weaverville changed too, growing more settled as the wild frontier days receded into memory. The whispers about that consumptive Boston girl Ross Abernathy married gradually gave way to respect for the capable woman who had not only survived against the odds but thrived, raising a family and becoming an integral part of the community. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1893, Ross surprised Nora with a party that brought together friends from throughout the region. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the ranch yard, he drew her away from the celebration to the meadow where he had first confessed his feelings for her. 20 years, he marveled, holding her close as they looked out over the mountains they both loved. "Remember when we thought we might only have 1 or 2? Nora leaned back against his chest, still strong despite the silver now threading through his dark hair. "I remember being afraid to hope for even that much. And now look at us." Ross gestured toward the lights of their home, where their children, Thomas now 17 and preparing for college, Rebecca 15, and already showing signs of her mother's musical talent, and James 13, and determined to be a rancher like his father, were entertaining their guests. Not bad for a consumptive and a fool who kissed her anyway. Nora laughed, turning in his arms to face him. At 42, she was no longer the pale, frightened young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Weaverville. Lines had formed at the corners of her eyes and mouth, testament to years of laughter and occasional sorrows. But her eyes were clear and bright, her body strong, her spirit undiminished. "I think," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him, "that was the wisest foolish decision anyone ever made." Ross smiled against her lips. "No regrets then?" "Not one," Nora assured him. "Not a single one." As they walked hand in hand back toward the lights of home and family, Nora reflected on the long journey that had brought her here. From the whispers and averted gazes in Boston drawing rooms to the open sky and honest love she'd found in California. From a diagnosis that had seemed like an ending to the beginning it had ultimately become. They had faced it together, just as Ross had promised that day in her uncle's cabin. And together, they had not merely survived, they had lived, fully and completely, in defiance of all predictions and expectations. The disease that had threatened to define and limit her life had instead led her to a love and a life beyond anything she could have imagined. The whispers that had driven her west had faded into the background of a story still being written, day by day, in the shadow of the Trinity Alps, with the man who had been brave enough to kiss her and promise they would face whatever came together. And they had. And they would continue to do so, for all the days that remained to them, which, Nora was now certain, would be many.